Well, folks, since Microsoft took over Activision Blizzard, there's been a pretty big question mark over the future of BlizzCon, especially as it was skipped last year. This week we got a bit of a glimpse of its future with some good and bad news. More on that shortly. This news was quickly eclipsed by a major update from the World of Warcraft Development Team on a feature that's certainly been getting a lot of interest from the player base. That is, of course, player housing. But before I dive into all of that, if you're not a subscriber, then please do consider hitting that button before you forget. Subscribing is by far the best way to support my channel. Following on from the update a few weeks ago that set out the high-level goals for player housing, this time around the development team has chosen to do a deep dive into what is, for me, probably the make-or-break feature for the player housing system. And I suspect it's an update that has been a major surprise to at least some of the folks out there. I've seen quite a few commentators express some doubts about how flexible the interior decorating system would be, given that the World of Warcraft's game engine support for player-based objects has always been pretty limited. Limitations that were clearly on display in the Warlords of Draenor Garrison. The good news is that it appears that the developers have been able to overcome those limitations, with the new decorating system offering two different modes. In basic mode, we will be able to freely place and even rotate objects and decorations, albeit with collision detection, which will prevent clipping into other objects. Smaller objects will also be able to be connected to those larger objects. For example, a vase placed in a table will move with the table if you move it. And there'll also be a snap to grid function to make it a lot easier to align objects with each other. Overall, this basic mode is very similar to systems in other games like Final Fantasy XIV or even The Sims, and I think it's intended to make it easy for us to set up and decorate our homes without having to struggle with common 3D issues like figuring out how to make the objects look like they're sitting on the floor, and I suspect it will be more than enough for the majority of players. But if that's not enough for you, then there's also going to be advanced mode, which will allow for almost unlimited flexibility. In advanced mode, you'll be able to push items into walls, leave them hovering in mid-air, and even rotate them in any possible axis. It's going to be possible to switch between the two modes at any time, which will enable us to quickly set up the basics of a room before perhaps diving into that advanced mode to fine-tune things to perfection. Now, I've personally been hoping for the level of flexibility in basic mode as a minimum, and it at least looks like a system that will feel pretty natural and satisfying. So getting the advanced mode is very much the icing on the cake, and I'm really excited to see what I and others will be able to do with this new system. The update has also teased a few other cool features, including the announcement of a dyeing system, which will allow us to change the colours of newly created housing assets, including the ability to change the colour of upholstery separately from the frames of objects. This particular update also hinted at the possibility that existing game assets will also be available, albeit without the dyeing system. This opens up the prospect to give us a lot more decorating options at launch, as it won't necessarily be just constrained by the ability of the team to produce new assets for player housing in time for launch. There's no word on what that will offer, but imagine if you could use the assets from Borealis or perhaps Suramar. We also got a few hints on the bigger picture of the new system, including the ability to customize wallpaper and ceilings, and even be able to use partition objects to allow us to create walls in the interior of the house. And on the subject of the sizing of the player houses, it appears that they're going to be TARDIS-like, with the size of the inside being completely independent of the size of the exterior, allowing you, for example, to have a huge interior inside of a tiny shack, or vice versa. Now, one major worry that I know quite a few people had was that the housing system is just going to be a full-on orc versus human theme, but at least for the interior we'll likely have a lot more options, with the WoW team sharing a couple of images that interestingly they described as screenshots, which shows a mixture of dwarf, blood elf and night elf decor. I have to say that if this is, shall we say, actual game footage, my appetite for player housing has been well and truly whetted. Getting this level of detail from a new feature before it's even on an alpha or a beta is kind of unprecedented for Blizzard, at least in recent times, and the fact that they are doing this so early does make me think that they are going all in to try and make player housing a big success. There are still a lot of unanswered questions about the system as a whole. In fact, I have a full video where I discuss those questions and my hopes and fears. Link down below for that. So I'm definitely going to be watching for those promised future updates. If, like me, you are a player housing stan, then I have a feeling that this is going to be a very long but also very exciting year. The other big announcement this week was in Blizzcon, and I'm going to start off with the good news. Blizzcon is coming back on the 12th and 13th of September 2026. And of course, that's the bad news. When I first saw the announcement, I missed the 2026 bit. It wasn't until the day after that I realised that Blizzcon is actually returning next year and is going to be skipping this year as well. I suspect that this is likely going to be the new normal for Blizzcon, where instead of it being an annual event, it's going to be something that will happen every 2 or 3 years whenever Blizzard expect to have something major to announce, which obviously begs the question on what that big announcement will be. Midnight will almost certainly already be live well before September next year, which means it will almost certainly be getting the full announcement of The Last Titan. But BlizzCon is not WoWCon, so there's likely going to be more for either the other franchises or perhaps even a brand new game. For example, could Xbox be getting rolled into BlizzCon in some way? Over in the live game this week, we've seen the continuation of the race to World First, with first Echo taking the lead in the mid-Mythic boss progress, only for Liquid to manage to leapfrog them to take one-armed bandit down first, and then Method managing to catch up, making it a 3-horse race on the second last boss. Much of the conversation has been on the unexpected high difficulty, with the first weekly reset passing before any of the major guilds reached the second last boss, and raising the possibility of a 3-week race. In my view, this is probably not good news for the more mainstream Mythic guilds, many of whom feel that they are locked out of progression until the post-race nerfs. It's hard to say if this difficulty was intended by the dev team or if it's just overtuning, but I really feel that this continued escalation in Mythic raid difficulty is not good for the wider raiding scene, where the gap between heroic and Mythic difficulty has, ever since really Season 2 in Shadowlands, been contributing to a slowly declining Mythic raiding scene. At some point, something is going to have to give here for the long-term health of the game, and I for one would prefer to see the development team take the lead on addressing the problem, instead of being dragged kicking and screaming to the table by declining player numbers, which if nothing changes is, I think, where we are headed right now. This difficulty does not prevent a second kill of Mythic Scallywigs, seemingly by the same or a similar group to the ones who made the first kill last week. This kill was also very quietly removed from the Hall of Flame by Blizzard without any comment, but not before the wider community spotted it, meaning that this is either a repeat of the previous exploit or a brand new one. This does demonstrate the challenges that Blizzard have in this area. For you and me, getting a character perma-banned would be a crushing blow, but exploiters generally treat characters as being quite disposable, similar to the way that ban waves of bots, especially in Classic, don't always seem to have much impact on the problem. The other piece of fallout this week from the race to World First was a hotfix to convert Mythic Raid BoEs to be bind and pick up, which went a bit wrong and was applied to all levels of Raid BoEs, the result being that players found their auction house listings being cancelled and untradeable items getting stuck in their bags. Now, Blizzard did at the time confirm that this was an error, but I saw quite a few affected players who never got that message, leading to a lot of upset and disappointment. The good news is that this has now been resolved, and those non-Mythic Raid BoEs are back to being tradable and listable in the auction house, and this has been applied retrospectively. I just hope that not too many of the people who were farming them for gold ended up equipping them or destroying them. That particular change, though, does not apply to the Mythic Raid BoEs. They will continue to be bind and pick up, at least until the race to World First is over. On the Mythic Plus front, the initial week does seem to have had a fairly positive response from the community after the disappointments of Season 1. For me personally, I found the progression curve from level to level to feel a lot smoother, without the jarring gaps and progression walls of the Season 1 curve, and I'm feeling pretty optimistic about the new season. It wasn't perfect, of course, with Priory and Operation Floodgate feeling like major outliers in terms of difficulty, along with the final boss of Theatre of Pain. Thankfully, Blizzard do seem to have learned the right lessons from Season 1, and just a few days into the new season, they stepped in with some very hefty targeted nerfs. The surprise though is that those targeted nerfs were accompanied with a blanket 10% reduction in NPC health and damage, which has effectively shifted the entirety of Mythic Plus downwards by about 1.5 key levels. A quick look at the Raider.io stats though did provide a clue as to why Blizzard took this action, with the success rates of dungeons, especially at the lower levels, being quite a bit lower than the equivalent week in Season 1. With this being followed up this week with another set of even more targeted nerfs, it is great to see Blizzard stepping in so quickly. First impressions are really important in video games, and a positive end to the first week can do a lot to encourage participation over the longer term. Moving over to the 11.15 PTR, and while this week's PTR build was mainly just a few bug fixes, we have now had a bit of a chance to dive in and do some exploring and figure out what's coming up in the near future. Back when the Warband reputation system was announced, we were informed that while the older expansion reputations would not be Warband wide at the launch of the War Within, Blizzard did plan to go back and start converting them later on in the expansion. Now honestly, I'd been starting to wonder if that plan had been quietly dropped, but the good news is that it hasn't, with the main Shadowlands reputations being converted to be Warband wide on the PTR. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the Shadowlands renown system is not reputation based, and so it is not included in this conversion. Instead, it's the Covenant reputations such as Court of the Harvesters, the Ascended, Avowed and Undying Army that will be converted. There's a full list on the screen now. It's really good to see this particular thread being picked up, and I'm hoping that we'll see a lot more of the reputations being converted in the near future. I started playing my current main in Battle for Azeroth, and I would love to see my pre-BFA reputation progress being transferred over to it. When the return of Horrific Visions was announced, it was a pretty safe assumption that this version would not be encumbered by the limited access to visions that we had back in BFA 8.3, which was one of the major factors that caused a lot of players to actively dislike the visions first time around. The good news is that this is now confirmed. You can, if you want, run them as much as you want, and there's no need to rank up a legendary cloak, with the cloak's sanity reduction progression system being moved into a revamped tech tree instead. Like the original version of Horrific Visions, you will be pretty limited at first and by how long you can spend in a vision, so there'll be no full clears in run 1, but by progression of visions you will over time gain the ability to spend more and more time in them. Unfortunately, on the PTR, this does appear to be a bit time-gated, with possibly 3 unlocks per week out of 12 possible, leading to a 4-week wait to max the progression tree out. Now do be aware that time gating on the PTR can change. It is not unusual for things to be sped up for testing, so potentially on the live game it could even be longer. I personally think that this is a bit of a mistake on the part of the developers. That mechanic where you had to decide how long to push into the vision before going to the final boss, and were getting it wrong would wipe the run, was not a lot of fun first time around. It probably will be a lot better without that added pressure of losing out in cloak upgrades and being permanently behind for weeks, but many of us have very bad memories of that pressure, and being forced to wait to get more skill ups before we can do a full clear is going to be bringing back those bad memories. So I do hope that Blizzard rethinks this before launch, rather than making it, as has been a pattern in recent minor patches, something that they hotfix in a few days after the launch in response to player feedback. Now, if you're wondering what the rewards are going to be for going back into those visions, we do have a few more details now. One of the new rewards is going to be the return of corruption effects like Twilight Devastation. These have been changed to be weapon enchants on the PTR, but Blizzard have confirmed that they are now looking at changing that so that they might go on to other slots instead, or perhaps even be embellishments. As the system's still a bit in a work in progress, it's not 100% clear how we will acquire them. Along with corruption, there's a bunch of new Void themed mounts, including the Voidfire Death Cycle. This particular mount will require you to collect the parts for the cycle from the visions before assembling it into the mount. Mounts are also going to be a major part of all of the 11.1.5 events, including 8 in total from Visions, 2 from the Nightfall Event, and 1 from Dastardly Duels. There's also, on top of that, a brand new dual crafting mount, the Void Crystal Panther. So if you're a mount collector, you can expect to be a bit of a busy bee in 11.1.5. The centerpiece of the patch is the Nightfall scenario, which is going to be an hourly timed public event that lasts about 10 minutes. It's hard to get a good handle on these events on the PTR, as there's rarely many players doing them, and the events do tend to be a lot better when they are busy. But this does seem to be a lot more combat driven than some of the more recent events, and that is giving me some hope that it may be a bit closer to time rifts in terms of fun, something that's going to be very important, as there's a 10-step renown track attached to this, so we'll likely be doing quite a lot of them. Well, that's all the updates for this week. I'd be super interested to hear your thoughts on the changes to Horrific Visions. Do you think that they'll make it appeal to a wider audience, or are you expecting it to be another horrific experience? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this update useful, interesting, or just infuriating, then do hit that like icon to let me and YouTube know. And if you didn't earlier, then this is your last chance to subscribe and hit that bell icon to get notified whenever a new update from me goes live. I have a ton of cool guides, reviews and news to come that you won't want to miss. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.